Somewhere in the back of a carp's throat, there is a second mouth. It doesn't bite, it sorts. Every mouthful that fish lifts off the bottom, your bait, a cloud of silt, a snail shell, a waterlogged leaf, gets pulled in, tasted, and graded in under a second. The good stuff gets crushed and swallowed. Everything else gets blown straight back out through the gills. So most anglers spend their money on a bait the fish will notice. The harder problem, the one the tackle wall has no reason to explain to you, is building one it won't spit back out. Here is the part most people get wrong. A carp's upper jaw isn't fixed. It shoots forward into a round tube and pulls in a whole column of water, bait and bottom and all. The food never gets chewed up front. There are no teeth up front to chew with. The grinding happens deep in the throat, where a set of pharyngeal teeth crushes everything against a hard pad set into the skull. I've spent years on the feed side of all this, formulating what farmed fish actually eat, reading the ingredient panels nobody at the lake ever sees. And once you've watched how a fish truly processes a mouthful, you stop picturing a carp as having a mouth at all. It's a pump, with a sorting line bolted onto the back of it. The researcher who mapped this in the most detail is Ferdinand Sibbing, at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. He filmed carp feeding under X-ray, and he found something you can use on the bank, a patch of sensory tissue on the roof of the throat, called the palatal organ, sorts real food from grit and spits the rejects back out. The fish runs quality control on every single mouthful. Sit with that for a second. Before a carp ever swallows your hookbait, it has already pulled it in, weighed it, and decided whether it feels like food or feels like a trap, which means the real game starts long before the bait goes anywhere near the water. It starts with whether the fish can even find the signal you're putting down. And on that one point, the bait most of us reach for first, a can of corn, is the one that goes the quietest of all. Corn catches carp. Let's be straight about that up front, because half the internet will tell you corn is useless, and that isn't true either. Corn works. It's bright, it's cheap, and a carp will happily eat a mouthful of it. What corn isn't is loud. Think about the difference between a sealed jar of food and an open one. The sealed jar might be packed with something a fish would love, but until it leaks into the water, the lake has no idea it's there. Corn is close to a sealed jar. It's mostly starch and sugar. It hands the fish calories once it's already eating, but it leaks very little of the chemistry that pulls a fish in from across a flat in the first place. Now open the jar. The thing carp actually home in on is dissolved amino acids and fatty acids, the chemical fingerprint of real, living food. Snails, bloodworm, the larvae down in the silt. A properly prepared oil seed leaks exactly that. It lays a chemical address into the water that says, in the only language a carp reads, easy protein, right here, start digging. And it isn't only about the signal, it's about what the fish gets when it commits. Corn runs low on a couple of the building blocks a carp can't make for itself, the amino acids it has to take in from food to grow. A hemp seed carries a far more complete set, somewhere around a quarter protein and close to a third oil. So the fish isn't just pulled in by the smell, it's rewarded for staying. The signal says food, and then the food turns out to be true. That is how a swim builds confidence instead of burning out by mid-morning. And one word on safety, because you'll hear this one repeated. Corn does not kill fish. Prepared corn is fine. It goes into commercial fish feed every day. The only real caution is hard, dry, unsoaked feed corn, which anglers have long warned can swell after a fish takes it in. That's a sensible precaution, not a proven fish killer. Soak anything dry before it goes in the water, and the worry disappears. So why has almost nobody handed you the louder option? Here is the quiet logic of it. You can trademark a flavor. You can patent a clever boilie shape. You can put a whole season of marketing behind a jar and sell it back to you every spring in fresh packaging. You cannot do any of that with a plain bag of seed. It's a raw commodity. No markup, no brand, no peg on the wall with a logo on it. Nobody buried this. The market simply never had a reason to put it in front of you. But the seed has a catch of its own. Straight out of the bag, it's asleep. And the way most people try to wake it up is the exact thing that kills it. A dry seed is a closed system, dormant, sealed shut. Drop it into water and a switch flips. Water works its way in, the shell turns permeable, the enzymes wake up, and the seed starts releasing its solubles outward. The amino acids and the oils that are the whole point. That isn't instant. It takes most of a day. So here is the method, and it's mostly patience. First, you soak. Cold water, roughly 3 parts water to 1 part seed, for a full 24 hours. Not warm water, cold. Over that day the seed swells, nearly doubles, and the water around it turns cloudy and smells faintly of nuts. That cloud is the signal leaking out. Hold that thought, because this is exactly where people pour it away. Second, and take this as the channel's reasoned stance rather than gospel, do not drain that water. That cloudy liquid is the most concentrated dose of the precise chemistry you are trying to put into the lake. Draining it is throwing away half of what you just made. Third, the heat. And here your instinct sends you the wrong way. Everyone assumes longer is softer, and softer is better. With an oil seed, long boiling is how you cook the life out of it. You break down the very oils that carry the signal. So you don't simmer it for an hour. You bring the whole pot, seed, and cloudy water together, up to a hard rolling boil, and you hold it only briefly, just until the shells start to split and show the pale kernel inside. Then off the heat, and let it cool right there in its own liquid. One real safety line, because it matters for the fish. The soak is not optional. Hydrate the seed all the way through before it ever goes in. A seed that goes in dry can keep swelling after it's eaten. Soak it properly, and you've taken that risk off the table entirely. What you're left with looks like every other small, dark, natural thing on the bottom. Leaking scent, holding its oils, ready to go. A signal with a solid chemical core, but a signal is only half of it. A scent with no address drifts nowhere in particular. So the next question is how that cloud actually travels, and how a fish a long way off ever finds the end of the thread. Picture a drop of dye in a glass of still water. It blooms slowly outward in a widening ball. Now picture that same drop in a slow stream. It stretches into a long ribbon trailing down current. Your bait does both. In a still lake, your scent spreads as a slow, expanding cloud. In a river, it lays out a long thread pointing downstream. A carp never has to see any of it. It tastes its way up the thread. This is where the biology stops being folklore and turns into something you can lean on. John Caprio, a neuroscientist at Louisiana State University, spent a career mapping how a fish actually tastes the water around it. His simplest finding is the one that should change how you fish. In a catfish, and the same chemistry runs right through the carp family, the taste receptors aren't only in the mouth, they run across the whole body. The fish is, in a real sense, a swimming tongue, and the sensitivity is on a scale we have no instinct for. These animals register certain amino acids at concentrations so faint you would struggle to measure them in a lab, traces far below anything a person could taste or smell. So when we stand on the bank arguing about whether a bait smells right, we're asking a question the fish answers with its entire skin, at a resolution we can't come close to matching. That is the real reason the cloudy water matters. You are not flavoring a swim. You are laying a chemical trail a fish can follow from well outside of sight. And notice what that quietly tells you about the flavored jar. The fruit, the vanilla, the candy smell. All of it is tuned to your nose, on the bank, in the shop. The fish was never the customer for that smell. You were. The amino acids leaking off a plain seed were never marketed to anyone, because there's no one to market a raw commodity to. And yet they speak the one language the fish was actually built to read. And here's a turn most people get backwards. When the water colors up after rain, most anglers groan and pack away. Muddy water, tough day. But think about what just happened to the fish. Its eyes went nearly useless, so it leans even harder on the one sense that still works clean, chemistry. A bait that talks through amino acids doesn't fade in dirty water. It gets louder. The exact conditions that send everyone else home early are the conditions your seed was built for. So the trail goes down, the fish turns onto it and starts to track. It closes in, and right at the moment it should commit, the rig you set is about to tell it, in no uncertain terms, to leave. Go back to that second mouth. The sorting line in the throat. This is where most good days quietly die. Here is the why. Remember what Sibbing's X-ray work showed. The carp inhales a whole column of the bottom, and the palatal organ grades it. Food gets kept. Anything that feels wrong gets blown straight back out. Peter Wainwright, the suction-feeding researcher at the University of California, Davis, explains the other half of it. Fish that feed by suction have lost their front teeth entirely because teeth up front would only fight the inhale. The whole head is built to vacuum and to sort fast. Now picture your rig dropped into that system. Hundreds of small, light, identical seeds lying on the bottom and parked right in the middle of them. A heavy hook on a stiff link with a big bright bait, 3 times the size of anything around it. The fish inhales the lot. The seeds flow in weightless. Your hookbait lags, drags, sits there heavy and wrong against the roof of that sorting organ, and out it goes, before your alarm so much as twitches. So here is the how. You stop fighting the sort and start passing through it. Downsize. Drop to a small, sharp, fine wire hook, somewhere in the size 12 to 16 range. Use a light, supple link, not a stiff one, and match the weight of your hookbait to a free seed. So when the fish inhales, your bait flies in just like the rest of the bed instead of anchoring in place. A balanced hookbait, one that hovers at neutral weight, gets drawn to the back of the mouth on the very same breath as the free offerings, and the mistakes to avoid. Don't go big to feel safe. Big is exactly what gets rejected. Don't run a stiff, heavy link that telegraphs resistance the instant the fish lifts it. And don't bury a small hook so deep in the kernel that the point can't take hold. The point has to stay free to turn. Do this, and you've solved the one problem nobody sells a fix for. There is no product on the wall called "doesn't get spat out." It isn't a thing you buy, it's a thing you understand. Everything to this point, the prep timings, the don't drain rule, the rig sizes, and the actual researchers so you can check every word for yourself, is gathered onto a single page you can tape inside your tackle box lid. Point your phone at the code on screen, and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay, because you can do all of this perfectly and still empty a swim in seconds by standing in the wrong square foot of the lake. You can build a perfect signal and hide a perfect hook, and still blank if you put it where the fish aren't. So read the water like it's a feed map, because that is exactly what it is. Start with current. On a river, carp won't fight fast water all day for nothing. They sit where fast water meets slow. The inside of a bend, the seam alongside the main flow, the slack behind a feature. That's where fine silt settles, and the food settles with it. That seam is the dining room. Put your bait on the quiet side of it, not out in the rip. On a lake, the food clings to edges, the line of the weed bed, the drop where 2 feet of water steps down into 6 or 8. Old riverbeds and channel edges on a reservoir are underwater highways. Find the edge and you've found the route. Now the part with hard physics behind it. In summer heat, warm water simply cannot hold as much dissolved oxygen. That's measured. It sits in the USGS solubility tables. It is not an opinion. So when a shallow flat bakes up past the low 80s, the oxygen there thins out, and the fish leave it. If you're fishing 2 feet of water in the dead heat of a July afternoon, you may be fishing a dead zone. The same fish may be feeding hard at 10 to 15 feet, where it's cooler and the oxygen holds. Depth is not just a number. It's where the life is. Then there's wind, which most people treat as a nuisance and the sharpest anglers treat as a delivery system. A steady wind drags the surface water and the food drifting in it toward the bank it's blowing into. The small life stacks up on that windward shore, and the carp follow it in. So the cold, miserable bank with the wind in your face is often the one holding feeding fish. The comfortable bank at your back is usually the empty one. And one honest correction, because you'll hear the opposite stated as law. The old line is that a dropping barometer turns the carp on right before a storm. The truth is more careful than that. David Ross, the oceanographer at Woods Hole, has pointed out that the pressure change a fish actually feels is tiny. The barometer is better understood as a clock for changing weather than as a switch for the fish's appetite. Something often does shift before a front. But pinning it on barometric pressure alone is a story anglers told to explain a pattern they couldn't see the cause of. Fish the conditions: light, wind, temperature, food, not the needle. And none of this carries a price tag either. There is no gauge that reads feeding zone. It's earned by reading water, which is free, which is exactly why nobody sells it to you. So, found them, fed them, hid the hook, read the water. There is still one thing left that can clear the whole swim in a heartbeat, and most people do it without ever realizing. Carp hear you. Not the way you'd guess. Better. Cyprinids, the family carp belong to, carry a chain of tiny bones called the Weberian ossicles. They link the swim bladder to the inner ear and turn the whole gas-filled bladder into something like an eardrum. It widens the fish's hearing range and sharpens it. On top of that runs the lateral line, a row of motion sensors down each flank that feels water move. Horst Bleckmann in Germany and Sheryl Coombs have spent careers on it, and the short version is that a fish builds a picture of its surroundings out of pressure and vibration. Think of it as a kind of touch that reaches out across open water, so here is what that means for your morning. A heavy boot on the bank, a dropped lead, a bucket banged down on a platform. To you, it's nothing. To a fish 20 yards out, it's a hard knock on the surface of its entire world. The water carries it straight there. The best anglers you'll ever watch move slow, set things down soft, and keep the noise off the bank. Not out of superstition, but because they understand the water is a wire, and they are standing on one end of it. It's the same reason the quiet hours fish so well. On waters that see a lot of pressure, carp slide their feeding into the low light, dawn, dusk, on into the dark, when the bank goes still and the boats stop. And in the dark, vision barely matters. The fish navigates almost entirely on the senses we've been talking about: sound, vibration, and chemistry, which is the exact hour a bed of scent-leaking seed does its best work, while a bait that relies on being seen goes blind along with the rest of the lake. Now the other side of sound, the part the old hands swear by. When one carp drops its head and starts grubbing through a bed of seed, more arrive. A crowd brings a crowd. Some of that is competition. A feeding fish loosens up, drops its guard, and the bites start coming in runs. That much is real schooling behavior. The idea that the crunch of feeding pulls in others is something anglers have watched on underwater cameras for years, and the science is starting to catch up. A recent Minnesota field study found that sound paired with bait drew carp into tighter, faster groups than bait alone. That's not proof of any one mechanism, but the direction is real. A working swim genuinely does pull in more fish than a silent one, and that too is something nobody can box and sell you. There's no jar labeled competitive feeding response. It's a behavior you set up, with patience and quiet, for nothing. Do all of this: signal, address, presentation, water, quiet. And something shifts under you. You stop guessing. You start predicting. Everything here reduces down to 4 words: location, signal, presentation, restraint. Location, you read the water and put the bait where the fish already travels. Signal, you wake the seed properly and let the cloudy water do the talking. Presentation, you downsize until your hook rides in on the same breath as the free bait and beats the sort. And restraint, the one nobody likes to hear: don't dump it all in at once. A carp that gorges on a pile of bait gets full and drifts off. Feed small, feed often, a handful, then wait. You keep the table set without ever filling the room. The signal stays lit, the fish stays and searches. One caution before any of it goes in the water: carp are an introduced species across much of this country, and the rules on baiting, chumming, and what you're even allowed to use change from state to state and water to water. Check your local regulations before you bait up. An edge only counts if it's a legal one. Now go back to where we started, to that second mouth in the back of the throat, the sorting line that inspects every single thing the fish lifts off the bottom. Nothing about the fish changed while you listened. Same pump. Same throat teeth, same palatal organ, grating every mouthful the way it has for millions of years. What changed is that you can finally see the test it's running, and you've stopped handing it a bait that fails on contact. You are not feeding the water anymore. You're feeding the fish, in the one language it actually reads, With something that costs less than a can of corn, none of this was locked in a vault. It just was never worth anyone's while to put on a shelf. Because you can't patent a seed, and you can't sell understanding back to a person every spring in fresh packaging. If you'd rather fish knowing what the bottom is actually doing, the part the wall was never going to explain, then you already know which side of this you're on. Subscribe, and we'll keep pulling the rest of it back into the light, one forgotten thing at a time.